You know it's hard to be yourself, free yourself, when all around you there are lies just to get you inspired, just to get you to buy so they can get you too. There are cameras in the skies, lasers in our living room. There are wolves watching wearing sheep's costumes. It's enough to make you go crazy. It's enough to make you mad. Whoa, oh, oh. It's enough to make you go crazy. Yeah, and I'm amazed I haven't yet. Isn't it a shame the way we treat each other, beat each other? It's a shame the way we use one another, abuse one another, confuse one another. It's true. They will lock you up in prison, but they won't call it slavery. There are stolen children raised and trained in armies. It's enough to make you go crazy. It's enough to make you mad. Whoa, oh, oh. It's enough to make you go crazy. Hey, and I'm amazed I haven't yet. So don't hesitate to speak your mind. Never hesitate to speak your heart. They'll call you crazy when you speak your mind. But never hesitate. Never hesitate. It's enough to make you go crazy. It's enough to make you mad. Oh, 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 it's enough to make you go crazy. Hey, and I'm amazed I haven't yet. You think you've got it, can sing along. It's enough to make you go crazy, enough to make you mad. It's enough to make you mad. Whoa, oh, oh, it's enough to make you go crazy. We'd be crazy not to care.
Good morning. If you could all get comfortable in your seats, as comfortable as you can get anyway, and close your eyes gently and take in a few deep breaths. And then exhale slowly. Get yourself relaxed and comfortable. As you become relaxed, I'd like you to think of a time and a place where you were in a state of grace. Perhaps you didn't even know it at the time. Maybe you felt connected to the universe. Or you felt good by helping somebody in your community. Or the joy of just being alive. Now imagine this feeling going deep inside and lifting your spirits. Feel how this can be all the time. And that you can feel a sense of grace over and over again if you open your mind and your spirit to the possibility of grace. Take a moment in silence and reflect and savor this feeling. The reading today comes from a sermon given by Reverend Ann Fox, who was the minister at UU Church in Fairhaven, Massachusetts. What is this thing called grace? Is it that which is in us, and yet beyond us? Is that God, or God by some other name or creative force? That's for you to decide. I think our first source from which we draw inspiration indicates grace. I remind us of the words of the first source, direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder, affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces that create and uphold life. I'd like to think we connect with grace more obviously when we gather like this, and we experience it in the various elements of worship, in the music and the hymns, or some part of the liturgy. We experience it too in nature and in our relationships. Perhaps the mass of people who know most about grace are those who go to Alcoholics Anonymous. AA members acknowledge that they cannot fight their demons of addiction alone. They practice radical honesty and radical interdependence. But their dependence on community can only take them so far. And so they encourage to ask for help from a higher power, whatever they mean for each of them. Many say that AA is like the early Christian church, in which there was great acceptance of people in all walks of life who would not normally come together otherwise. Also, their openness to the Spirit of grace is like that of the early church.
I can see clearly now the rain is gone. I can see all obstacles in my way. Gone all the dark clouds that had me down. It's gonna be a bright, sunshiny day. Yes, I can make it now, the pain is gone. All of the bad feelings have disappeared. Here is that rainbow I've been praying for. It's gonna be a bright and sunshiny day. It's gonna be a bright sunshining day. It's gonna be a bright and sunshiny day. It's gonna be a bright sunshining day.
Good morning again. On this unseasonably warm, I keep saying that. I've been saying that for the last couple of weeks. I had to bring out the summer stuff again. It was already in storage. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Sherry for her kind introduction and Avi for his great music, as always. I know you feel fortunate having somebody of his talent as a member of your congregation. Grace Wins in the End is the title of an article written in UU World by Reverend Chance Hunter, who has one of my all-time favorite names. It sounds like a baseball pitcher, doesn't it? Chance Hunter now pitching for the Chicago Cubs. They need him, yeah. And it gave me a new perspective on this whole concept of grace, which we UUs don't really talk about very much. But it should be and can be part of our faith. Now, there are several kinds of grace, The most obvious one, of course, is the prayer we say before a meal, giving thanks for the bounty we're about to receive and for the friends and family who are sharing it with us. Then there's the grace that's embodied in the phrase, "There but for the grace of God go I," which all of us, I think, have said at one time or another in our lives. After we've seen perhaps a homeless person on the street or a terrible accident in which somebody was injured, maybe even killed. But the question is, did God's grace prevent us from being that homeless person or prevent us from being in that accident? And if so, why? Reverend Ann Fox says this in a sermon, another sermon she gave on the subject of grace. "I find it hard to believe that God intentionally breaks into someone's life to lead them, guide them, or make things happen for them, but not for another person." I think we've all seen the baseball player who points up to the sky after he's hit a home run, or a football player who does the same thing when he scores a touchdown. But what about the pitcher who threw the pitch that allowed the guy to hit the home run? Or the linebacker who missed the tackle that allowed the runner to score the touchdown? Now, was God's grace absent from those guys? And then, what if that same hitter struck out with the bases loaded in the bottom of the ninth and he lost the game for his team? Or that runner fumbled at the goal line and lost the game for his team? Did God say, "Sorry, fellas, you've already had enough grace. That's it"? Of course, there are negative situations in which people try to rationalize the absence of God's grace. They often say, well, it's God's will, or God has a plan that we mortals can't possibly fathom. Several years ago, my brother Russ was near death from a ruptured aneurysm. And while he was touch and go, some of his friends wrote into the caringbridge.com website. You may have seen several websites where you can post messages and get updates on a sick person. A number of these messages said, well, Russ, we hope you make it through, but if something happens, it's God's will, or something of that nature. Of course, when he did survive, guess who got the credit? God's grace. Did you ever think God is in a win-win situation? Unfortunately for we Unitarians, that logic, that kind of blind faith doesn't always work. For me, as an atheist, it makes no sense at all. But even for agnostics, which I think most UUs are, that leaves us kind of skeptical. Now, there's another grace that I want to focus on for the rest of my talk, and that comes in the phrase state of grace, which I used to hear a lot about when I was growing up as a Catholic in Buffalo, New York. And the freedictionary.com website defines state of grace this way: a state of sanctification by God, the state of one who is under such divine influence. The Virgin lived in a state of grace. Now notice it says the Virgin, not a virgin. So celibacy only gets you so far. When I was a kid and went to church and catechism, I went to a public school, so I went to catechisms on Monday. The nuns and the priests would periodically make reference to state of grace, but in a way that was so otherworldly that it was hard to relate to for myself. I mean, they always talked about state of grace where they talked about saints and holy people and sanctification and all that kind of stuff. And so I never really gave grace much thought as I got older, because I really didn't think that it was possible for me to be in a state of grace. But what I loved about Reverend Hunter's article was that he posed grace as very egalitarian, that it was there for all of us, that you didn't have to be a saint or somebody who was particularly holy or born again. It was there for all of us. And that one of the problems that we have is that we just don't recognize grace when it happens, or the potential for grace. He writes, "Grace is learning something new and amazing about a friend you've had for years. When we hear a song by a group we've never heard that changes our lives, or when we make a difference when we volunteer to help someone or something." I've been a tutor in the Philadelphia public schools this is now my 16th year, and for most of those years I tutored 4th, 5th, and 6th graders in math. And like most teachers, do we have any teachers in the audience here? I think you can relate to this. You never really know if the kids really get it. You keep teaching and teaching and teaching, and sometimes you get a blank stare that says, "I have no idea what you're talking about." But every once in a while, a light bulb goes on, and you understand that they got it. And on those occasions, it feels really good that you really communicated and helped that kid. And I recognize now that was a state of grace for me. And I also feel a state of grace when I help out other people. Tomorrow I'm bringing my good friend Howard to a doctor's appointment. He had just had foot surgery. But I also feel the same way when I bring a meal to someone or do good things for another person, and I'm sure all of you have felt that as well. But grace doesn't have to occur when you're doing something good. The minister at the UU Church in Washington Crossing, Reverend Charles Stevenson, said this about grace some years ago. "Grace is having the deep and strong feeling that you are okay in the universe. You are accepted just as you are by something greater than your individual life. This grace does not exist because someone's life was sacrificed for you. You do not need to do anything about it." He later goes on to say that grace is experiencing the joy of being alive in the here and now and being part of the interconnected web of life. And if that last phrase sounds familiar, it's one of our UU principles. Scientists have found that that interconnectedness, when we feel connected in a community, regardless of what that community is, it has health benefits, and that it can, in fact, in some cases, increase our longevity by 50%, which sounds pretty dramatic. When my brother Russ was recovering from, in the early stages of after his surgery for that aneurysm, he was under sedation because the doctors didn't want him to pull out all those various tubes that were in him accidentally. So he was just there sort of in a otherworldly state for several days. And we all took turns holding his hand and talking to him. And the nurse said, "He won't remember you talking to him, but it will help him to recover." So my other brother, my sister and I, and Russ's family, his wife and kids, all took turns holding his hand and talking to him. And I now know that was a state of grace, and it really brought me closer to my brother, who differs from me in just about every way you can think of, from politics to religion, especially politics and religion, as a matter of fact. He is going to vote for Donald Trump, unfortunately. Art and nature can also provide a setting for a state of grace. Years ago, on my first trip to Italy, my wife and I were in Venice, and we were visiting this small church, which had a portrait of Titian. Thanks, Jim. And if you've been to Italy, you know that great art is everywhere, and often in churches. And this was maybe 5 feet high and 3 feet wide on the altar, very small, unassuming church. It was the Assumption of the Virgin. There's that Virgin again. And when I walked in, I became transfixed by this painting. I couldn't take my eyes off it. And when I got into a pew and sat down or knelt down, I can't remember which, I just kept staring at this painting, and I was like in a zone. Did you ever feel that way? You're kind of in a zone, and you don't know why, but you're just transfixed. And I now know that that was a state of grace. When I mentioned this to my friend Steve Kennedy, who paints portraits for a living, he smiled and he said, "You know, great art makes you see God." And even for an atheist like myself, that resonates. Nature also provides an opportunity for a state of grace. I know when I joined my former church, Unitarian Society of Germantown, it happened during a kind of state of grace. I was doing a walking meditation. Everybody here ever do a walking meditation? Buddhists do this, and as a matter of fact, this was part of a Buddhist walking meditation before service on a Sunday. And I was still visiting, and I wasn't yet a member of the church, and trying to decide what church I was going to join. And there was this tree sort of shimmering. This was in November, I think, actually. And it had all of its leaves. All the other trees had lost their leaves, but this tree had its leaves sort of shimmering, and somehow that just spoke to me. It wasn't exactly the burning bush, but it was a symbol for me. And I now know that was a state of grace. I used to run marathons before my knees gave out, and one of my favorite places to run was Forbidden Drive in Philadelphia. If you've ever been to Forbidden Drive or have a chance to, it's really a great place in Fairmount Park, and there's by the Wissahickon Creek, and it's just, you can't imagine you're in Philadelphia when you're running on this path. And I used to train there when I was still running marathons, and usually with my Sony Walkman, listening to cassettes. You remember those? And I had a cassette of classic rock and roll, and I put it on and started to run, and it came to In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. All you boomers can remember In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. And something happened. I started to run faster. Wasn't consciously running faster. I just started to run faster. It was like I was on automatic pilot or something. And then I started to feel lighter, and it was almost as if my feet were barely touching the ground. And then I felt this sensation of well-being, almost giddiness, and started to smile and even chuckle a little bit. And I'm sure the people who were on the path thought I was a little bit strange. But it was a great feeling, didn't last forever. But I now know that that was a state of grace. The thing is that you don't have to be in a positive situation to feel grace. Paul Tillich, who's one of the great theologians of the 20th century, talks about this in his book, which is a compilation of his sermons called Shaking the Foundation. And he says, grace strikes us when we are in great pain and restlessness. It strikes us when we walk through the dark valley of a meaningless and empty life. Sometimes at that moment, a wave of light breaks into our darkness. Reverend Ann Fox commented on this in her sermon on grace and said, for me, A wave of light breaking in makes more sense and coincides with my own experiences. In dark times, after much ruminating for hours or days or weeks of feeling stuck, I have gained an insight that has moved me along to a more beneficial and creative place. I call it restoration of creative energy. Would I call it grace? Yes, I would. The more I have opened myself to the process of creative energy or grace, the less time I have spent stuck in an unhappy place. She also made mention of the fact that my definition of grace doesn't have to be your definition of grace, and that we can all define grace the way we would like. The beauty of grace is, as Reverend Hunter writes in his article, is that it's always there waiting to happen. We just have to be aware of it and be open to it. Unfortunately, in most of our lives, we're rushing from one thing to another, madly crossing things off our to-do lists, and never thinking about what we're actually doing when we're doing it, because we're so concerned about getting it done so we can go to the next thing, and the next thing happens the same way. So we don't take time for grace. That is to say, we don't allow ourselves to be in a position for grace to happen, or at least to recognize it. We're often so busy looking at our smartphones. But as far as I know, there's no app for grace. You really have to just take time for it. And one of the ways that I take time for grace is to meditate in the morning for about 30 to 40 minutes. That's a good way to sort of get your whole mind and body thinking about the possibility of grace for that day. Marianne Williamson, who writes a book called Everyday Grace, suggests taking a 30-second break in between your to-do list items just to take a deep breath and just open yourself up to the possibility of grace. Another way to be experiencing grace is to do something that I mentioned earlier, and that is to do the things that you do all the time, and that's being of service to other people, to our friends, to our family, to our community. I noticed your collection today is benefiting a group in the area, as was the case in my church. And it doesn't have to be anything special. But being of service to other people is a great way to achieve grace. And as a matter of fact, the Dalai Lama once said the best way to achieve happiness is to be of service to other people. And I think sort of happiness and grace sort of go together. When I say happiness, I don't mean happiness ha ha ha, but happiness, a kind of a sense of well-being, a sense of, as the minister said earlier in the talk, being okay with the universe, being connected to other people. And finally, I want to mention a speech that was given at the UU General Assembly by Galen Gingrich, who is the lead minister at All Souls Church in New York. And if you've never been there and you're going to be in New York, I urge you to go there. I always refer to it as the Cadillac of UU churches, although Cadillac and Unitarians doesn't seem to go together, so maybe it's the Volvo of Unitarian churches. And anyway, it's on the Upper East Side on Lexington Avenue, and Forrest Church, the great UU minister, used to be the pastor there. And Gingrich gave a great speech at the General Assembly in Charlotte in which he talked about how we are different, our denomination is different from other mainstream denominations, in that mainstream denominations, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, for example, take their holy books and revelations and then whatever else their holy people talked about, and they try to fit what those words are into today's world, which doesn't always work because so much of that stuff was thousands of years ago, and very often it's like a round peg in a square hole. Whereas we use use all of those holy books and revelations and sayings of prophetic people and look at the world today and say, how can I lead a purposeful life? And use those tools to help us lead a purposeful life. And I would suggest that one way to lead a purposeful life, to find grace, is to lead a purposeful life. And he says, imagine a better world and set our moral compass to get there. And I think if we do that, grace will follow us wherever we go. May it be so. Thank you.